Right now, somewhere in Tehran, in rooms most of the world will never see. While a small group of aging clerics who have run Iran for nearly 5 decades are getting briefings they never wanted to receive. And tonight, I'm going to walk you through exactly what happened, why it happened, and why it might be one of the most important military stories of the year. So stay with me because this one is genuinely wild. Over just 2 days, the United States military hit more than 170 separate targets inside Iran. And if that number doesn't sound big to you yet, give it a minute, because by the end of this video, you'll understand just how massive an operation that actually is, according to you. Central Command, known as CENTCOM, American forces struck roughly 170 Iranian military targets across 2 rounds of strikes, one on a Tuesday and one on a Wednesday, and that came right on the heels of another wave just days earlier that hit around 140 additional targets inside Iran. So in a single week, we're talking about well over 300 targets being hit across Iranian territory, which is not a small skirmish. That is a sustained, deliberate, large-scale military campaign. And it is happening right now in the Middle East, while a lot of people are still catching up on the news. Let's slow down for a second and actually explain what's going on here in plain, simple language. Because 170 military targets can sound abstract until you know what it actually means. When CENTCOM says targets, they're talking about specific physical sites. Air defense systems that are supposed to shoot down incoming missiles or jets, storage facilities packed with drones and missiles, military boats sitting in ports or patrolling waters, and logistical infrastructure, which is basically the fuel depots, communication hubs, and supply routes that keep a military running. The strikes reportedly hit Iranian missile and drone sites, naval capabilities, ammunition storage facilities, communication networks, and coastal surveillance locations, much of it concentrated near the coastline close to the Strait of Hormuz. If you're not familiar with the Strait of Hormuz, this is the name you need to remember for this entire story, because almost everything happening right now revolves around this one narrow strip of water. The Strait of Hormuz is a slim maritime corridor separating Iran from Oman and the United Arab Emirates, and it happens to be one of the most important choke points for global oil shipping on the entire planet. A huge percentage of the world's crude oil physically has to pass through this strait on tankers, which means whoever controls or threatens that strait can, in theory, threaten the global economy itself. So when the U describes these strikes as an effort to protect commercial vessel transits through this waterway, what they're really saying is that this is about keeping global oil and shipping routes open and safe. And that is a big deal because oil prices, shipping insurance costs, and even what you pay at the gas pump can all be affected by tension in this one relatively small stretch of sea. Now here's where the phrase in our title comes in, the idea that Iran's leadership, often referred to as the Mullahs, because Iran is officially a theocracy run by Islamic clerics, is in a state of panic. To understand why that framing exists, you have to understand who these mullahs actually are and how the system works. Iran has been governed since 1979 by a system built around clerical rule, with a supreme leader sitting at the very top of the power structure, holding authority over the military, the judiciary, and ultimately the direction of the entire country. Beneath that is an elected president and parliament, but real power, especially over security and foreign policy, tends to run through the clerical and military establishment, most notably the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, which isn't just a regular army branch. It's an ideological military force created specifically to protect the revolution and the clerical government itself. So when a Western headline talks about the mullahs panicking, it's referring to this entire leadership apparatus, the clerics and the military commanders tied to them, suddenly facing a level of direct, sustained American military pressure on their own soil that they haven't experienced in this way before. Whether panic is the right word is something reasonable people can debate, and we'll get into different perspectives on that later. But what is not in dispute is that having over 300 sites hit inside your own borders within a single week is an extraordinary, rare, and deeply destabilizing experience for any government, let alone one that has spent decades building up its deterrent power specifically to avoid ever being in this position. So how did we even get here? Tensions between the United States and Iran are not new. They go back decades, rooted in the 1979 Iranian Revolution, the hostage crisis that followed, and a long history of proxy conflicts across the Middle East, where Iran has backed various armed groups and militias in countries like Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen, while the U has maintained a heavy military and naval presence in the Gulf region to protect its allies and keep shipping lanes open. Over the past several years specifically, there's been a pattern of escalation and de-escalation, strikes and counterstrikes, warnings and retaliations, almost like a long-running chess match where neither side wants a full-blown war, but neither side wants to look weak either. In the lead up to this most recent wave of strikes, reports indicate that there had already been a buildup of hostilities connected to attacks on commercial vessels moving through the Strait of Hormuz, attacks that the EU and its regional partners have attributed to Iranian action or Iranian-backed forces. There were also reports of a direct warning from the American president to Tehran before the most recent strikes were carried out, suggesting this wasn't a surprise attack out of thin air, but rather the culmination of an ultimatum that apparently wasn't heeded. When we talk about how something like this is produced or how it comes about in a military and political sense, it's produced through this exact kind of buildup. Provocation, warning, response, counter-response, and then, eventually, a major operation like the one we saw here, where the U moved from smaller incidents to a large coordinated bombing campaign across Iranian territory. Let's get into the details of exactly what happened during these strikes because the specifics matter and they tell you a lot about the scale of this operation. According to CENTCOM statements, the U used precision munitions launched from both land and sea. This includes fighter aircraft, drones, and naval vessels, hitting a wide spread of targets that included Iranian missile and drone sites, naval capabilities, ammunition storage facilities, communication networks, and coastal surveillance locations. On a separate night, described by CENTCOM in a public statement, U forces struck Iranian military command centers, maritime capabilities, missile and drone launch sites, UN air defense systems, and the stated purpose was explicitly to degrade Iran's ability to continue attacking commercial vessels flowing through the Strait of Hormuz. What's notable here is the specific language, degrade Iran's ability to continue attacking, which tells you the US framed this entire campaign as defensive and protective in nature, aimed at safeguarding international shipping rather than simply attacking Iran for the sake of attacking Iran. CENTCOM also didn't shy away from putting numbers to the bigger picture of what they say they're protecting, stating that since early May, CENTCOM forces have helped facilitate the transit of approximately 900 commercial vessels and 450 million barrels of crude oil through that corridor. Those are staggering numbers, and they help explain why the EU considers this region such a critical national and global security interest, because if that flow of vessels and oil gets disrupted even briefly, the ripple effects on global markets, fuel prices, and supply chains could be severe and immediate. It's also worth talking about how this rippled out into the wider region within the same window of time. Because Iran doesn't exist in a vacuum, its actions and the EU response to them affect its neighbors directly. Reports from the region noted that Kuwait intercepted what were described as hostile targets. Sirens sounded in Bahrain warning civilians of potential incoming threats, and Jordan reported that it had downed Iranian missiles over its own airspace. Think about what that actually means for a second. We're talking about multiple sovereign countries across the Gulf region simultaneously activating air defense systems and issuing public warnings within the same general time frame as these American strikes on Iran. That is the textbook definition of a regional crisis, not a contained bilateral dispute between just two countries. When missiles are being intercepted over Kuwait, sirens are going off in Bahrain, and Jordan is shooting things out of its own sky. You're looking at a situation where an entire region is on high alert, bracing for the possibility that this conflict spills over into a much wider and more chaotic confrontation involving multiple nations, none of whom necessarily want to be pulled into a war between the EU and Iran, but all of whom sit close enough geographically that they simply can't stay out of the blast radius, literally or figuratively. Now let's talk a bit about why this matters, not just for people living in the Middle East, but for basically everyone watching this video anywhere in the world, because this is where the importance in daily life part of the story really kicks in. The Strait of Hormuz isn't some obscure geographic footnote. It is one of the single most important pieces of infrastructure in the global energy trade. A massive share of the world's oil exports pass through that strait every single day, moving from Gulf producing nations toward markets in Asia, Europe, and beyond. If that flow gets disrupted, even temporarily, oil prices can spike almost overnight. Because oil prices influence the cost of virtually everything: transportation, manufacturing, plastics, heating, electricity in some regions. A disruption in the Strait of Hormuz doesn't just hurt oil traders on a screen somewhere. It eventually shows up as higher prices at your local gas station, higher costs for shipping goods, and ripple effects through inflation that touch ordinary households thousands of miles away from the Gulf. It keeps emphasizing those numbers about facilitating the transit of hundreds of commercial vessels and hundreds of millions of barrels of crude oil. Because in the American government's messaging, this entire military campaign is being framed as protection of a global economic lifeline, not just a regional military dispute. Whether you find that framing fully convincing or view it with more skepticism is up to you, and we'll touch on different viewpoints on that shortly, but understanding the economic stakes helps explain why a conflict happening in a strip of water most people couldn't find on a map suddenly becomes front-page news everywhere. Let's talk now about Iran's side of this, because it's important to present this fairly rather than just repeating one government's narrative. From Iran's perspective, and from the perspective of those sympathetic to Iran's position, the framing looks very different. Iranian officials have historically argued that their military posture in the Gulf, including their naval presence and their missile and drone programs, exists as a deterrent against what they see as decades of American and allied military pressure, sanctions, and interference in the region. Iran has long maintained that its actions near the Strait of Hormuz are a response to what it considers hostile encirclement by forces and their regional partners, and Iranian leadership has in the past framed strikes against commercial shipping or American assets as retaliation for specific grievances, whether that's sanctions that have crushed its economy, assassinations of its military commanders, or direct military action taken against it. So while officials describe their strikes as necessary to protect global shipping, Iranian officials would likely describe the same series of events as an act of aggression against a sovereign nation, and would frame their own prior actions as defensive responses to being cornered. This is a really important part of understanding any conflict like this, because both sides almost always describe themselves as the ones acting defensively and describe the other side as the aggressor. And figuring out where the truth actually sits requires looking past the headlines from either side and considering the broader pattern of actions and consequences over time. Let's shift now to talk about some of the key features of this specific military campaign that make it stand out, because not every round of U-Iran tension looks like this one. First, the sheer scale is unusual. We're talking about over 300 targets struck within about a week when you combine both waves of strikes. Higher, and that kind of volume suggests a level of planning, intelligence gathering, and coordinated execution that isn't thrown together overnight. Second, the use of precision munitions launched from land, sea, fighter aircraft, drones, and naval vessels, all in combination, tells you this wasn't a single branch operation. It was a coordinated multi-domain campaign pulling together different parts of the American military apparatus at once. Third, the specific targeting of things like air defense systems is strategically significant because taking out an opponent's ability to detect and shoot down incoming threats is often one of the very first priorities in any serious military campaign. It's sometimes referred to informally as opening the door, because once air defenses are degraded, further strikes become easier and riskier for the defending side to prevent. Fourth, the emphasis on hitting coastal and maritime targets specifically, boats, coastal surveillance, and maritime capabilities, tells you this entire campaign was laser-focused on the Strait of Hormuz and Iran's ability to threaten shipping there, rather than being a broader campaign aimed at, say, toppling the government or targeting deep inland infrastructure. That distinction matters a lot when you're trying to judge how far this conflict might escalate, because a campaign specifically aimed at maritime and coastal military capacity is different in scope and intent from a campaign aimed at regime change or total war. Now let's talk about some common misconceptions floating around online about a story like this, because when something this dramatic hits the news, misinformation and oversimplification spread incredibly fast. One common misconception is that 170 targets means 170 individual buildings, or bases in the sense of major installations, when in reality, a target in military terminology can refer to something much smaller and more specific, like a single radar station, a single missile launcher position, a single small boat, or even a communication relay tower. So while the number sounds enormous and the scale genuinely is significant, it doesn't necessarily mean 170 massive bases were leveled. It means 170 distinct points of military value were hit, some large, some comparatively small. Another misconception is the assumption that a campaign like this automatically means full-scale war has begun or is inevitable. Military campaigns focused on specific capabilities, like this one appears to be, focused on air defense, drones, missiles, and coastal assets tied to shipping threats, are sometimes designed specifically to avoid full-scale war by demonstrating overwhelming capability and resolve without pursuing broader objectives like occupying territory or removing a government from power. That doesn't mean escalation to a wider war is impossible. History has shown that miscalculations happen, but it's a misconception to assume that any large strike automatically equals total war. A third misconception worth mentioning is treating the phrase Mullahs panic as a confirmed fact rather than a media framing choice. We don't have direct, verified insight into the private emotional state of Iran's top leadership. So while it's reasonable to assume this level of pressure is deeply concerning to them strategically, describing it definitively as panic is more of a dramatic narrative choice than a documented fact, and it's worth keeping that distinction in mind whenever you see headlines using emotionally loaded language like that. Let's talk about risks and precautions here, because this is a live, evolving conflict, and there are real risks tied to how this could unfold from here. The most immediate risk is regional escalation, the kind we already touched on with Kuwait, Bahrain, and Jordan all reporting activity connected to this conflict. If neighboring countries get pulled deeper into direct confrontation, whether through accidental strikes, miscalculated retaliation, or deliberate targeting by any party involved, the entire Gulf region could see a much wider and more chaotic conflict than what we're seeing right now. Another major risk is economic disruption tied to the Strait of Hormuz itself. If Iran or any actor in the region were to successfully disrupt that shipping corridor for an extended period, the global economic shock in terms of oil prices and shipping costs could be severe and immediate, hitting economies and households far beyond the Middle East. There's also the ever-present risk of miscalculation in any high-tension military standoff like this, where one side misreads the intentions of the other, leading to a response more severe than what was actually intended. And history is full of examples where wars started not because either side truly wanted total war, but because signals were misread in the heat of the moment. For everyday people, especially anyone following this story from outside the region, the practical precautions are less about direct danger and more about staying informed through credible, verified sources rather than relying on dramatic headlines or unverified social media claims, because conflicts like this tend to generate an enormous amount of exaggerated or outright false information very quickly, and separating fact from rumor is one of the most valuable things you can do as a viewer trying to actually understand what's happening. Now, let's compare this moment to similar past incidents because context helps a lot here, and this isn't the first time we've seen the U.S. carry out large strikes connected to Iran or Iranian-backed forces. Go back to early 2024, when the United States launched retaliatory strikes against more than 85 targets linked to Iran's Revolutionary Guard and militias. It backs across locations in Iraq and Syria, following a deadly attack on American troops in Jordan that killed 3 U.S. soldiers. In that earlier case, the strikes did not hit targets inside Iran itself. They hit Iran-linked proxy forces and facilities in neighboring countries, which is actually a really important distinction when comparing it to the current wave of strikes we're discussing today. What makes the current situation different, and honestly more serious in some ways, is that these more recent strikes are hitting targets directly inside Iranian territory itself, not just Iranian-backed proxies operating in other countries. That's a significant escalation in scope because striking a country's sovereign territory directly carries a different level of political and military weight than striking proxy forces operating abroad. In the 2024 strikes, the U.S. dropped more than 125 precision munitions across roughly 85 targets, and even that was described at the time as one of the most significant American military responses in the region in years. Compare that to the current wave, over 170 targets in just 2 days, on top of another 140 targets in the days before that, all seemingly within Iran's own borders. And you start to see just how much bigger and more direct this current campaign really is when placed side by side with recent history. Let's also take a moment to talk about the human and humanitarian dimension of all this, because it's easy to get lost in numbers of targets and strategic analysis, and forget that real people, military personnel, and potentially civilians, are affected by operations like this. In the earlier 2024 strikes against Iran-linked targets in Iraq and Syria, reports at the time indicated that dozens of people were killed, including both fighters and, according to some local officials, civilians as well. Whenever military strikes happen at this scale, especially across multiple sites over multiple days, there is always a real human cost in terms of casualties among military personnel, potential civilian harm, and the broader human toll of living through active regional conflict, whether that's economic disruption, fear, displacement, or the psychological toll of sirens going off and missile interceptions happening in your own country's airspace, as we saw reported in places like Bahrain and Jordan. It's important, whenever discussing a topic like this, to hold both the strategic and geopolitical analysis alongside a recognition that real human lives are affected by decisions made at the highest levels of government, often by people who will never personally experience the direct consequences of those decisions in the way ordinary citizens and soldiers on the ground do. Let's zoom out now and talk about why this story matters in the bigger picture of global geopolitics, beyond just the immediate details of who struck what and when. This conflict sits at the intersection of several major global dynamics that have been building for years. First, there's the broader U.S. strategy in the Middle East, which has long centered on maintaining stability in the Gulf region, specifically because of its outsized importance to global energy markets. And any American administration, regardless of political party, tends to treat threats to Gulf shipping as a serious national security priority because of how deeply intertwined the global economy is with steady oil flow. Second, there's Iran's long-standing strategic doctrine. which for decades has relied heavily on asymmetric tools, meaning things like proxy militias, missile and drone programs, and naval harassment tactics rather than trying to match American conventional military power directly, because Iran has long understood it cannot compete with the US military in a straightforward, symmetrical fight. Third, there's the regional dimension, with countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Jordan, all having their own complicated relationships with both the US and Iran, wanting stability and economic security, but also not wanting to be forced into taking sides in a way that drags them into direct conflict. And fourth, there's the global economic dimension we've already discussed at length, tying together energy markets, shipping insurance, inflation, and financial markets worldwide, all of which can be affected by sustained instability in this one narrow strip of water. When you put all of these pieces together, you start to see why a story that might sound, on the surface, like a distant regional military dispute actually has threads connecting it to gas prices, global trade, financial markets, and international diplomacy on a truly worldwide scale. Let's talk a bit more about what might happen next, while being careful to frame this as informed speculation rather than certainty. Because nobody, including seasoned military analysts, can predict with total confidence how a live, evolving conflict like this will unfold. One possible path forward is that Iran, having suffered significant degradation to its air defense, missile, drone, and naval capabilities near the Strait of Hormuz, may choose to pull back from direct confrontation for a period, focusing instead on rebuilding capacity and relying more heavily on diplomatic channels or proxy actions, rather than direct engagement, at least in the short term. Another possible path is further escalation, where Iran or its allied forces respond with their own strikes or provocations, potentially targeting American assets, allied nations, or commercial shipping again, leading to further rounds of U.S. response and a continuing cycle of strike and counterstrike that could last for weeks or months. A third possibility involves diplomatic intervention, where international pressure, whether from the United Nations, European allies, or regional mediators, pushes both sides towards some kind of ceasefire or negotiated de-escalation, something that has happened in past periods of US-Iran tension when the risk of full-scale war has felt too costly for either side to continue pursuing. Which of these paths actually plays out will depend on a huge number of factors, including domestic political pressures within both the US and Iran, the responses of regional allies, and how much damage has genuinely been done to Iran's military capabilities versus how much capacity it retains to continue projecting force in the region. Before we wrap up, let's talk about how you, as someone watching this video, can actually stay informed on a fast-moving story like this without falling into common traps that a lot of people fall into with breaking international news. First, be wary of headlines using highly emotional or dramatic language. Phrases like panic, collapse, or imminent war are often chosen because they generate clicks and engagement, not necessarily because they represent the most accurate measured description of what's actually happening on the ground. Second, pay attention to primary sources when you can. Official statements from military commands like CENTCOM, established international news organizations with reporters actually covering the region, and multiple corroborating sources rather than a single unverified post or video circulating on social media. Third, remember that numbers like 170 targets need context to be meaningful. Understanding what a target actually is, how it compares to past military operations, and what the stated strategic purpose behind the operation is will give you a far more accurate picture than the number alone. Fourth, hold space for the fact that both sides of a conflict like this will present their own narrative, and the most complete understanding usually comes from considering multiple perspectives: American strategic framing, Iranian strategic framing, and the experiences and statements of regional countries caught in between, rather than accepting any single narrative as the entire truth. So, to bring this all together, what we're looking at is a major escalation in the ongoing tension between the United States and Iran, centered specifically around the Strait of Hormuz and the safety of global commercial shipping passing through it. Over the course of about a week, U.S. forces struck well over 300 Iranian military targets, including air defense systems, missile and drone sites, naval capabilities, command centers, and coastal surveillance infrastructure, using a combination of fighter aircraft, drones, naval vessels, and precision munitions. This came after reported warnings from American leadership to Tehran and against a backdrop of ongoing threats to commercial shipping in the region. The ripple effects were felt across the wider Gulf, with Kuwait intercepting hostile targets, sirens sounding in Bahrain, and Jordan downing Iranian missiles over its own territory, underscoring just how quickly a bilateral conflict between two countries can spill outward into an entire region on high alert. The stakes here go far beyond just military strategy, touching global oil markets, international shipping, and by extension, the economic well-being of people all over the World who may never think twice about a narrow strait near Iran, but who will absolutely notice if gas prices spike or global trade gets disrupted because of instability there. Whether Iran's leadership is truly in a state of panic, as the dramatic framing suggests, or whether they're calmly recalculating their next strategic moves behind closed doors, is something we may not fully know for some time, but common traps that a lot of people fall into with breaking international news. First, be wary of headlines using highly emotional or dramatic language. Phrases like panic, collapse, or imminent war are often chosen because they generate clicks and engagement, not necessarily because they represent the most accurate, measured description of what's actually happening on the ground. Second, pay attention to primary sources when you can. Official statements from military commands like CENTCOM, established international news organizations with reporters actually covering the region, and multiple corroborating sources rather than a single unverified post or video circulating on social media. Third, remember that numbers like 170 targets need context to be meaningful. Understanding what a target actually is, how it compares to past military operations, and what the stated strategic purpose behind the operation is will give you a far more accurate picture than the number alone. Fourth, hold space for the fact that both sides of a conflict like this will present their own narrative, and the most complete understanding usually comes from considering multiple perspectives: American strategic framing, Iranian strategic framing, and the experiences and statements of regional countries caught in between, rather than accepting any single narrative as the entire truth. So, to bring this all together, what we're looking at is a major escalation in the ongoing tension between the United States and Iran, centered specifically around the Strait of Hormuz and the safety of global commercial shipping passing through it. Over the course of about a week, EU forces struck well over 300 Iranian military targets, including air defense systems, missile and drone sites, naval capabilities, command centers, and coastal surveillance infrastructure, using a combination of fighter aircraft, drones, naval vessels, and precision munitions. This came after reported warnings from American leadership to Tehran and against a backdrop of ongoing threats to commercial shipping in the region. The ripple effects were felt across the wider Gulf, with Kuwait intercepting hostile targets, sirens sounding in Bahrain and Jordan, downing Iranian missiles over its own territory, underscoring just how quickly a bilateral conflict between two countries can spill outward into an entire region on high alert. The stakes here go far beyond just military strategy, touching global oil markets, international shipping, and by extension, the economic well-being of people all over the world who may never think twice about a narrow strait near Iran, but who will absolutely notice if gas prices spike or global trade gets disrupted because of instability there. Whether Iran's leadership is truly in a state of panic, as the dramatic framing suggests, or whether they're calmly recalculating their next strategic moves behind closed doors is something we may not fully know for some time. But what is clear is that this is one of the most significant military escalations in the region in recent memory, and it's a story absolutely worth continuing to follow closely in the days and weeks ahead. If you found this breakdown helpful in actually understanding what's happening rather than just seeing scary headlines fly by, consider sticking around, because stories like this tend to develop fast, and there's a lot more to unpack as new developments come in. Thanks for watching all the way through, and I'll see you in the next one.